opportunity, isn't it? YouTube.
Exactly. The podcast discovery on Spotify and Apple, it's kind of fucked.
Yeah.
YouTube, it's really good, but I've been having a lot of conversations with a guy called Jordan Harbinger, if you're familiar with him. He is a huge podcast. He's been doing it for like 15 years. So he's a really good person to speak with about this. His impression is, and I take his word for it, YouTube, social media, you grow a big platform there, very few convert to another platform.
Yeah.
So just because you have 1 million Instagram followers and even post cool clips and stuff, that's great. It might grow your Instagram, but it doesn't move the needle for them going to Apple or Spotify and subscribing.
Yeah.
And that gives me a lot of solace because I've made these efforts on social media and it just doesn't move the needle.
No, and it's also, how you want to spend your time. Because if you spend all your time on social media, you end up creating a certain type of content. Yeah. Do you want to be an influencer? Do you want to spend your time, I mean, I don't.
No.
And I often find this in journalism and broadcast. People are like, oh, great social media following. I'm like, why? Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Anyway, rambling.
Okay. I also introduced you in a separate video, which means we start with the first question.
Great.
Which is, who are the great explorers of history that you admire?
I think exploration comes into a couple of different ways. And I think you can have contemporaneous explorers today as well. And exploration is sort of the root of why we travel, which is rooted in curiosity. And that desire to look over the horizon and figure out what's there in a place where you know nothing is really mankind's, Homo sapiens, competitive advantage. That's what makes us different to other animals. And then curiosity also allows us to adapt to our environments. So every other animal has to evolve to adapt to its environment. Humans can use tools, society, culture to build things that allow them to adapt to an environment. So exploration in that sense is very innate within us.
Okay.
And in terms of the people who've done it remarkably throughout history, we don't know most of them.
Right.
The names that come up, obviously, are Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen for the Antarctic. And when you read the stories of what they did, just this desire to figure out what was out there against remarkable hardship and high risk of losing their own lives. And in Scott's case, he did lose his own life. There's a sort of impressive aspiration to discovery there, and planning and endurance, the name of Shackleton's ship, of course. So there's that. We talk about Columbus, Magellan from Europe, who of course did circumnavigation of the globe. Cook, he went and checked out Australia. But the story that really sticks with me actually is the Great Polynesian Migration.
Oh yeah, of course. The Wayfarers.
The Wayfarers, and you may have seen it in the Disney documentary Moana with The Rock, Dwayne Johnson.
Didn't get around to it.
So these are the people who started about 4,500 years ago in what's modern day Taiwan, and just developed new technologies, new ways of seafaring, to start by just hopping between islands, to eventually crossing big patches of ocean to get to places that would be on the horizon. And that took them a long time to figure out. But along the way, they developed these amazing skills, and they developed culture that was appropriate for that environment. And the greatest Polynesian explorer, navigator, is a guy called Kupe, and he's sort of pseudo-mythological.
What year?
He was cutting around the South Pacific around 1,000 years ago. So relatively recently in human exploration terms on the grand scale, but before Europeans were crossing the Atlantic, other than maybe the Vikings.
And before great record keeping.
So that's the thing that makes it really interesting, and why I mentioned that Kupe's a pseudo-mythological character, because in the historical records of the Maori of New Zealand and the rest of the South Pacific, or the rest of the Pacific generally, not just the South Pacific, oral tradition was what was the equivalent of record keeping, storytelling through telling people directly. So this wasn't written down. So the only way we can really trace it historically is by bringing together different myths and records from different regions of the Pacific and seeing what intersects and calling that truth.
Calling that truth.
As in, what is truth? when you know, what's truth historically? You have historical
Oh,
records.
right. You mean, yeah, just because it's an oral, does it actually mean it's true? Therefore, mythological, pseudo-mythological character.
Yeah, and obviously because within the stories of Coupe, you know, one of the best one is Coupe and the Giant Feke, which is an octopus, and it's a story of him chasing this octopus, and that's how he discovers New Zealand from what is now French Polynesia, right here, that area. And was he actually chasing a giant octopus? Probably not. But it's a metaphor for the ocean currents in that region about how he followed them down. And when I was in New Zealand a little while ago, I was in Tauranga on the Bay of Plenty, so it's North Island, and I met this guy there who is a navigator, and he was talking to me about rediscovering these techniques, because after the Polynesians had settled in New Zealand and become the Maori with their separate culture, there was less movement back and forth between New Zealand and the islands.
Yep.
And this navigator, Jack Thatcher, his name is, was telling me about how he had to rediscover some of these techniques. So he went out to French Polynesia and the Marquesas, which is another island group up there, and got to know people who were still using these techniques and used it almost as a sort of cultural education for young Maori people.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. To say some of the details about these fellas, isn't one of them that they might dip their sack into the water to like feel the current or something like that?
Yeah, and these people were navigating without clocks, without sextants, and without compasses, which is the way people navigated before GPS.
Yeah.
So until fairly recently, really.
Uh-huh.
And they had all these different techniques of figuring things out. So they would watch the migration of birds and of fish, knowing, well, these must have come from somewhere and there must be something over there, knowing that birds and fish find food in areas where you get upwellings against rock. Then there'd be flotsam and jetsam on the water. So if a coconut drifts in your direction from somewhere, you're like, well, there must be somewhere with coconut trees over there. And then, they would, some of them would be able to taste the water and taste the difference in salinity.
Oh, it's so amazing.
And knowing, there's fresh water near here, so we can't be too far from an island that has fresh water flowing on
it. Which isn't that ridiculous. Like, their senses would be so finely attuned since that was their entire environment, everything that they were doing.
Yeah, and these things, as Jack said, these things seem like magic to us now, but that, as you say, it was their entire environment. That was everything they knew.
And so what about the sort of, maybe downfall's a bit dramatic, but the deterioration of these Pacific Islander cultures over time? What have you observed?
So I'm not an expert on them, but just from speaking to the people that I met there, obviously the biggest thing that made the difference was the arrival of Europeans. And that did a couple of things. In both Australia and New Zealand, they were occupied, oppressed, and in some cases ethnically cleansed, and corralled into a type of society that effectively served the wider needs of empire or colonization in some cases. And so those skills were lost. The British brought new types of trading and new types of shipping that kind of replaced the old ways. But of course, one of the reasons that ocean navigation declined in New Zealand was they didn't need to navigate the oceans once the Maori culture had been established, because they had two massive islands to then explore. And so there's a multitude of different reasons why those skills were lost. And it's really cool to see people trying to bring those skills back. And Jack sailed on something called a wakahurua, which is a double-hulled ocean-going canoe. So you've got two hulls, you put a platform on it and a little shelter. And he used traditional navigational techniques to sail from Auckland to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, across to the Cook Islands and Marquesas. And I think he then went up to Hawaii. Right. I don't know if it was all the same voyage, but to demonstrate that it was possible to do these things. I don't know if he was tasting the water or just using the stars and that kind of navigation.
Also, another reason why these ancient explorers are so much more romantic in our eyes is because we have to assume that it was so dangerous. Hundreds, if not multiples of hundreds or thousands of expeditions before them would have never come back, yet they would still go out. And the journey to Hawaii, for instance, I mean, this is almost an unfathomable distance in a canoe, essentially.
Yeah, and what was cool, and Jack was basically talking me through the evolution of the Polynesian migratory skill and culture, in that they just developed it gradually and tested distances. And if you look at a map going from Taiwan through to Hawaii, I've got a globe. I'm going to grab the globe and show you.
Yeah, the YouTube experience.
Yeah, it's YouTube experience, multimedia. So you've got, if you look here, you've got Taiwan is up here. Yeah. And then from there, they kind of came down this way. And you can see, on the grand scheme of things, these islands aren't
down
too
the east
far
coast
apart.
of the Philippines.
Down the east coast of the Philippines. And then you've got this area called Micronesia. And you could sort of island hop through these areas into Melanesia, down sort of, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, down to Fiji, and then Samoa. And actually, they kind of paused for a long time there in the Polynesian migration. So as they went into these greater and greater distances, their skills of ocean going had to improve. And so it took sometimes a couple of centuries for them to develop the technology and skills. So this is very slow in terms of how quickly we develop and evolve skills with the kind of teaching and training techniques and technology we have now. They took a pause here for a while around Samoa until they then developed the skills to reach the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, and then if you like Easter Island, where's Rapa Nui? It's there. That's a huge distance to cross. And then Hawaii's all the way up there. So you're crossing vast amounts of ocean, but they took the time to develop those skills and techniques to then get to the next one.
Maybe my cliche understanding of the Maori culture is wrong here, but my understanding is that they're a pretty warfaring culture. They would routinely fight amongst each other.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Maori culture, but I don't think, any more than European cultures were fighting with each other.
The reason I say that is just to make the distinction for why they never took over Australia, or at least dominated some of these eastern parts of Australia, because we're the most obvious island next to them there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Maori were down here, but that's a good point. I have no idea why they never went over there. Yeah, right. It's just not something I particularly know about. I mean, they sort of... Maori culture is north to south New Zealand and out to the Chatham Islands. And, it's distinct from Polynesian culture, Fijian and Samoan and Cook Island culture. Yeah. Sorry, it's not an area I know a huge amount
No,
about.
fair enough. I don't want to, make you uncomfortable, ask you to explain some deep anthropological things. But you're an Englishman who spent quite a lot of time in both Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
What are your observations on the differences between how the Australians respect and think about and behave regarding their own indigenous population, the Aboriginals, versus how the New Zealanders do with the indigenous population, the Maoris?
I mean, I haven't studied this, but I can talk about it from my experience in travel journalism and my own travel. So it was noticing that difference that really set me on the path, probably, of being curious in travel. So I was 17 and I was at a local state school in Windsor, and that state school ran a rugby tour every few years. And the year that I was 17, the rugby tour I could have gone on was going to Australia, New Zealand and the Cook Islands. And my mum, we lived in social housing. Mum was on income support, but she had actually been to New Zealand to visit family in the 1970s. And she said, I think you'd love it. I think this is a really important opportunity. So she got a second job as a cleaner to pay for my ticket. I had to learn how to play rugby, which when you're 17 isn't the easiest thing to do.
And then you show up against these massive Kiwis.
Well, so I just turn up until I could just about catch a ball and just about tackle somebody and just about lean on somebody as a prop in a scrum. So that was the role I played. And we went out to Australia and we had a pretty good time there. We won in Perth, we won in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, and then we went up to Cairns. And Cairns was the only time I saw Aboriginal people or Aboriginal culture at all.
Never in Sydney?
No, not when we were there.
That's crazy.
Certainly not in the Blue Mountains.
Right.
This was 2001, so I don't know if it has changed. I don't know how the prominence has changed. But up in Cairns, there were we played a school where most of the students were Aboriginal. They played rugby league, we played union. It was an interesting game. Then when we got to New Zealand, as soon as I got off the plane at Auckland Airport, the signs are all in te reo Maori as well as English, so the Maori language. There's art all over the airport that is Maori art, and the designs and the styles. And Maori people were present everywhere. And our coach driver was Maori and was driving around talking about the legacy and the history of the land around Auckland and what all the different volcanoes were and the mythology around them. So it was present in New Zealand, like Maori culture is present in New Zealand culture in a way that it just wasn't as a national culture in Australia. It seemed much more marginalised in Australia. We turned up at college and they did a haka. Most of the people doing the haka were, white European origin New Zealanders. There were Maori kids in the school as well, and our response was we learned how to sing Jerusalem. I don't know if you've ever been to an England rugby or cricket game. It's not as intimidating as a haka. I feel they gained the psychological upper hand quite early. But I just ask people, what's it? And so I say to them, I notice this difference between the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and prominence in Australia and Maori cultural prominence in New Zealand. And they say, well, I mean, that's just the way it is. It's not something we really think about. Obviously, there's differences and there's still challenges, but that's just the culture we have. And so that really triggered this curiosity in me that I then went back and did research in New Zealand in particular as a journalist about the Treaty of Waitangi and the original, British colonisation of New Zealand and how that differed to what had happened in Australia. And, it wasn't always perfect. The British, as we are wont to do, broke our treaties with the Maori, occupied land that we weren't supposed to be occupying. And it was only really from what people said that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the sort of civil rights movement and civil society started to pull back some of those rights for Maori people. The Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, which started to do settlement for the breaking of this treaty back in the early colonisation days. And then, you go there now and things have happened like the change in the legal status of a river, so it gains personhood, the Wanganui River in the North Island, or Mount Taranaki, or different parts of New Zealand that have rights and status under the kind of law we're familiar with, but have its origins in the culture and mythology of Maori culture. So that's fascinating, and it just wasn't present at all in Australia. There's places where you go where the names are named after Aboriginal groups and Aboriginal people, but you don't see Aboriginal people, in my experience, as part of Australian society as you do Maori people in New Zealand society.
And in your observation, do you have an explanation for that?
I guess the differences are, occupying New Zealand was a very different process to occupying Australia. Australia has bigger land. I think the Maori were better organised at the type of war fighting that they needed to oppose the British. I think the treaties and things that occurred allowed some Maori groups to get hold of weapons earlier that gave them better ability to defend small territory that was more easily defensible than Australia.
Oh, so it almost comes down to just they defended themselves more effectively and therefore could force themselves more into the changing culture.
So I think there was an aspect of that. Like I said, I'm not a historian. This is me just having.
Don't worry, no one's going to hold you accountable for your opinions. It's just what do you think from your observation?
I think more of what it is I just don't know enough about the Australian story to be able to talk honestly about that.
The truth is, Ash, Australians don't know about it either.
Yeah.
I'm someone who's maybe more interested in this than the typical Australian. I still have absolutely no idea. There's, you can throw around a couple of theories, but it's not backed up by any sort of proper analysis or data.
Yeah, and I don't know what for New Zealand, my experience of writing about it in New Zealand as a travel journalist is that the Treaty of Waitangi gave Maori people in the 20th century a document they could go back to and say, look, the Crown has broken this agreement. That gave them almost a legal foundation to then do more from there. And it's sort of seen as the founding document of New Zealand. Right. So I think there's an aspect there. Because of the size of New Zealand, of course, there was better organisation and communication between the various different groups of the Maori, which maybe have made a difference. You've got more of a stake in debate and discussion.
Land size undoubtedly has to have a big part of it, because you look at the Australian East Coast and the English settlers think, we really like this land, but there's all this place, you can go ahead and take it and it's all yours. And it comes from a deep valley of ignorance to just proclaim that. But you can't say the same thing really in New Zealand because it's all forest. You can't just go, hey, go live in the forest. Don't worry about it.
Well, I think the difference that you see in the 21st century is, I think New Zealand went through an extremely difficult and challenging and painful period of acknowledging the fact that New Zealand as a nation is built on occupied, colonised land, and those indigenous people who were there before suffered as a product of losing that for the people that then became the Europeans arriving in New Zealand. And I just don't think Australians don't seem to, in general, have integrated that on a sort of emotional level. I think in New Zealand, that work was a mixture of civil society by Maori civil groups, the legal status of things like the Treaty of Waitangi, and then really this real pride that I found in New Zealand, not of everyone, but of many of the ones that I met.
There's outliers everywhere.
But of many people I met, there's sort of real pride of a biculturalism.
Right.
That to be Kiwi was to say kia ora and not just hello.
Yeah, like there's a lot of pride that this culture is also a part of our culture.
Yeah.
Australia certainly doesn't have that at all. The sense is more just we acknowledge that it was fucked, everything that happened, but let's just move on already. And I don't know if that is the right feeling to have about it, but nonetheless, I think that is the general consensus.
So I think there's efforts being made. As a travel journalist, I go to a lot of events, and Tourism Australia have hosted a couple of events recently. And right up front, before they say anything else, they'll talk about acknowledging the people who were the original owners of the land. So there's steps being taken.
It's such a vapid, pointless signalling effort. There needs to be something deeper than that. Like what you said, people saying kia ora, they're not saying, hey, that's huge. That means it's truly a part of the culture.
Yeah, and I think, I guess non-Maori New Zealand did have to be dragged into doing that from those pressure groups in the Treaty of Waitangi onwards.
Sense, yeah.
It wasn't just they were like, hey, let's do this. This is a really good thing.
This is cool.
And the other thing that makes a difference is the return of rights and resources and revenue to various Maori iwis that allows them to then have a financial stake in the nation and in the future. And the biggest thing that I notice as a difference is Indigenous-owned tourism and finding ways to then access that. So when you go around New Zealand, it's really easy to have Maori guides who tell you about the place and the history and what it means to them from their culture. That does exist in Australia, but you kind of have to go to the far north, up to the top end to find that really prominently. And I think having more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander guides and people who own tourism who are then able to tell that story of that land more effectively is probably the way Australia can share that story with the world and be able to integrate it more effectively for Australians. I mean, I don't know I'm sure it must exist around Sydney, but, if you walk around Sydney, it's not like, when you walk around Auckland, there's Maori people and Maori aspects of culture everywhere. And maybe there was just a bit more successful ethnic cleansing in Australia. I don't know I'm sure the original settlers in New Zealand from Europe would have been quite happy to have wiped out the Maori in certain places, and they just didn't manage it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a place called Malabar. The next suburb down is La Perouse. This was the biggest Aboriginal density population in Sydney. And, people were very, very, edgy, to say the least. Yeah, I think actually, regarding the cultural impact in New Zealand, we can't underestimate just how important it is that rugby is such a popular sport and that the Maoris are so good at it. And Australia and New Zealand are obsessed with sport, right? But the Aboriginal representatives within sport in Australia is significantly less so. Whereas the All Blacks is so central to the New Zealand culture, which is that it opens with a haka and all your best players are Maori.
Or Polynesian. There's a lot of Fijians, Samoans, and people from the rest of the Pacific Islands. That's what their heritage lies. And yeah, they're very good and they're very big. I played rugby down in Otago for a while. I mean, most of the people there were sort of descendants of Scottish farmers, but they were still massive. I mean, it was a pretty brutal way to learn how to play rugby properly.
Yeah, how did you go after winning a few games in Australia? Did you just get rolled over in New Zealand?
No, we won. The second team, which I was playing in, we won both of our games in New Zealand.
How'd you manage that?
I don't really know, but I remember the first team were playing their game in Cambridge, and the final... The game was kind of extended by about 10 minutes until the home team were able to have a penalty kick, and then they won the game.
Nice.
Maybe they just I think it was a
hometown advantage.
Hometown advantage. But we then went to go and play in the Cook Islands, and we played the national under-18 and national under-17 team, and they absolutely destroyed us. I mean, they were They were very good.
Did you ever watch this documentary by John Pilger? He's a dead Australian journalist now, but it was about the Marshall Islands.
Right.
Did you ever watch it?
I've not seen it.
Oh, okay. I thought that was somehow an explanation for the deterioration of these island nations.
Right.
But it was America in this case,
Right.
because I think these were actually somehow officially U.S. land. I'm not exactly sure, but basically the food fucked them. So they stopped fishing, and they were the most obese, highest smoking per capita people in the entire planet. But they lived on these island paradises surrounded by fish. And he, tells a pretty devastating story of decline and desperateness. Lots of meth use, really high suicide rates, all the sort of stuff.
Well, I think, people talk, when I saw the discussions in Australia around the vote that happened last year about whether or not to give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people representation at a sort of federal government level, some of the more malign narratives were about, well, there's a lot of drug use and alcohol abuse in Aboriginal culture. It's like, well, I mean, isn't that really a product of not allowing those people to live within their own culture? And this is something I heard in New Zealand. It's a difference between integration and cooperation. So do you force people to just become brown versions of yourself? Or do you allow them to be themselves and live in their own culture alongside you? And I think in New Zealand, it's still contested and it's still problematic. It's not a sort of multicultural paradise. These are still discussions that are ongoing. And I think that's another thing that New Zealand seems to accept well, and that you're not going to fix this or solve this or have a solution that answers every problem. But it has to be a continuous dialogue that will go on. Yeah. And within the Australian narrative, there doesn't really seem to be the idea that the Aboriginal culture should be allowed to just carry on being Aboriginal culture. They have to be part of what Australia is, and Australia isn't willing to shift what Australia is to allow space for Aboriginal culture in a way that I think New Zealand was maybe dragged into doing over the last 50 years.
I live in Sweden, and in my estimation, they're shocking at this integration, cooperation side of things. And I compare it with my own country, of city of birth, Sydney. I find a fantastic multicultural paradise in many respects. But you making that point is very true. It's the Aboriginal populace don't necessarily contribute, although we have every Greek, Italian, Lebanese, Vietnamese, Chinese, etc., all living quite happily side by side and working alongside each other.
Well, I guess that's because the Greek, the Vietnamese, the Italians and everyone else has come in and bought into effectively a Western capitalist mode of society. Whereas maybe some Aboriginal people are like, we don't want to just become Western capitalist people. We just like to get on with the society we had beforehand with some of the benefits and trappings of modern technology. And I mean, like I say, it's not a subject I know a huge amount about. I would like to go back to Australia. I've been, my sister lives on the East Coast. And I would like to go and do some travel journalism, exploring this a lot more.
Fuck yeah. I absolutely agree. I interviewed a guy called Mike Salbro. When I go back to Australia, I really hope to do something similar to what you've just said, some proper travel journalism that explores a community he's a part of called Cherbourg. So he was one of the last of the stolen generation. He was born in 1971, and he was adopted by a Swedish woman and actually was raised in Sweden, and then eventually went back to Australia to confront his birth mother, and then as well become a social worker in one of Australia's worst communities, which is Cherbourg, just outside of Brisbane.
And I guess for people that are watching or listening that don't know what the stolen generation was, this was basically a policy by the white government of Australia to take Aboriginal children away from their parents, forcibly remove them,
Put them in a white school.
and try and effectively turn them into brown white Australians.
Yeah. Just such a retarded, devastating policy from every perspective.
And hugely traumatic to, most people, again, I'm not a psychologist expert, this is just stuff that I've done in my research for Why We Travelled, the chapter on trauma. A lot of people who abuse alcohol or drugs are doing it as effectively a form of self-medication against the trauma that they experienced, often in childhood. And if you think about the Aboriginal people of Australia, they are either the stolen generation or the descendants of the stolen generation. Many of them, not all of them, obviously. That trauma is enormous. Being ripped away from your family and forced into something completely unfamiliar, being beaten if you use your own language, and being beaten if you don't use English. All forms of physical abuse, sexual abuse that happen to them. Of course they're traumatized. And if there isn't a sort of social and cultural way of healing other than become a white Australian, then of course they're going to turn to drugs and alcohol as a form of self-medication.
And it was another John Pilger documentary he did on the Australian. I think he was really, because this guy was operating at the height of television journalism, where the whole country would tune in, right? And he did the first real expose on how the Aboriginal population was treated within Australia. And I forget the person's name, but it was an Aboriginal player, a part of the Australian test team. And this is in the 70s. And he was one of their star bowlers, an incredible athlete. And they would go out to the pub afterwards, and he wasn't allowed in the pub. And he would stand outside the window, try to drink with the boys, and eventually was just, told to go away, which is
by his teammates or by the bar?
By the bar, but his teammates didn't do a good enough job of being like, let's make an exception here, mate. This is a bit ridiculous.
Or try and find a place, or
refuse to go to a place like that. Totally.
This
is only 50 years ago. This is the same. This is the time when both of my parents were teenagers.
Yeah.
So it does, on the other side of the coin, it does help me really understand why maybe, some people as old as my parents and older are like extremely prejudiced against it. Their environment the entire time reinforced that behavior. And so now my generation and younger generations, they just won't have a bar of it. It's just absurd that that would be a policy.
So I guess I'd never really thought about this before, but I guess sort of the whole of Australia has a bit of this psychological hangover that maybe the southern United States still do today. In the southern United States, you had effective apartheid and racial discrimination in law until pretty recently, until Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And that has affected the mindset of people still there today. So maybe the same in Australia. And I've watched a documentary about, what was the name of the Aussie rules footballer?
Adam Goodes.
Adam Goodes. And I saw a lecture there's an Aboriginal TV journalist who talks about how he'd spent a long time trying to talk about this stuff. And effectively, it was just too hard. And he was now going to stop doing it. I can't remember his name. But he did sort of the equivalent of the Reith Lecture in Australia. Yeah. And, going back to your original question, difference between Australia and New Zealand, the process of settlement and occupation and colonisation in both countries was quite different. Both in terms of the original foundations of the penal colonies in Australia. That didn't happen in the same way in New Zealand. So the whole process was quite different. And that's going to have an impact on the psychology of a nation hundreds of years later. 100 years later.
But moving away from these delicate issues, the Polynesians were your favorite explorers. What about in your research of great adventurers have you learned of stories and myths of people even beforehand? I'm thinking like the ancient Egyptian who maybe made it up to the United Kingdom, or the Viking who made it down to China, or the Chinaman who made it over to the United States or something like that.
I mean, these kinds of stories are always really interesting, aren't they? Because they're sort of, the other thing they do is sort of, historical what ifs, the counterfactuals. What would have happened if these people had settled there? I've done a lot of research about Ukraine. I travelled there, and the original Kievan Rus culture was basically from Viking culture, from Scandinavia. They came down through the rivers that end up in the Dnieper River, which is the one that runs into the Black Sea in the south. And it's just sort of discovering all these little legends and stories that affect the world that we're in today and shape the kind of world that we live in. Understanding some of the sources and origins are fascinating. I think the other challenge about over mythologizing and overlording individuals in exploration is it ignores the sort of cultural causes of exploration. So, you talked about it earlier with these explorers that eventually made it down to New Zealand and the hundreds of years it took to cross these different gaps in the Pacific. There's thousands of people that set the conditions for the successful person that we never even hear of.
Yeah, that one guy gets all the glory.
Yeah, that's the person that gets known. Whereas there's hundreds of other people, their families back home, who've made this possible. And I think when we talk about exploration, you often have the person who gets known for exploration is just often a bit of a weirdo, and quite single-minded, and doesn't really. Maybe they just can't fit into society back home, but they have this vision.
That's the case with most great people from history, though.
Yeah.
Definitionally, they were outcasts and weirdos, and people thought they were kind of nuts.
Yeah. And I guess what does that mean for today? And I think you can look at exploration in the modern day in a couple of different ways. You can have, you're not really going to find any new land. You're not really going to go to many places that other people haven't been to before. So it's about telling stories in places. So in 2014, I did a project called Walking the Nile. A friend of mine called Levison Wood, he walked the entire length of the River Nile from its source in Rwanda all the way up to Egypt. And I joined him for a couple of stretches. Now, there are people living along the entire length of the River Nile. We talk about the people that discovered the source of the Nile, speak in Burton. They were just the first white Europeans to be there. They weren't the people that discovered it.
To put it on the map, yeah.
They put it on our maps.
Right, exactly.
And for someone like Lev to go there and do that story, I think he sometimes finds it uncomfortable being called an explorer because he recognises some of those tensions, right? But what he is certainly doing is telling the stories of those places and those people to an audience that would otherwise know nothing about it. Yeah. So going to Rwanda and talking about the modern day legacy of the genocide that happened in the 90s, or going to Uganda and talking about the impact of poaching or deforestation or climate change, or the impact of huge Chinese corporations moving into the area. This is storytelling, and there's an element of exploration within that. So when I'm going somewhere to do a story, the exploration that I'm doing is I've got to do all my research and find out about it. And when I went to Ukraine in 2018, I had no mates. I didn't really know anyone. I don't think I knew anyone who'd been to Ukraine. Right. I mean, obviously, there are people from the UK who have been to Ukraine recently. But I had to kind of do everything from scratch, then finding the sources, finding the people, going there, and then just seeing it for myself on the ground, and then having conversations with people there. So that's that element of exploration. I think what we think about historically of exploration is the first curious people to look over the horizon, the first people from their society who've never done anything before, never been to that place before, to look over that horizon and go, I wonder what's out there. And that's the root of all travel. I wonder what that's like.
Totally. Someone who does deserve all the glory, though, Percy Fawcett. Tell us about him.
I don't know anything about Percy Fawcett.
Percy Fawcett, he was right at the end of the height of the, I think, late 1800s sort of well-funded, really well-famous British explorers.
This should know about this person.
You absolutely should. It's called The Lost City of Z, written by David Graham.
Yes. Yeah.
So the story of Percy's, just in my opinion, I project and romanticize on it so much. I wouldn't have the balls to do it myself, what he was doing, but he had, over the course of his life, 4 or 5 major expeditions into the absolute middle of nowhere Amazon. And to the point where, he sort of had a whole routine. He would dance like a bit of a funny guy and give out cigarettes and stuff to tribes that kept trying to kill him. He ultimately perished in the Amazon in pursuit of the Lost City of Z. But this was a guy who was a captain in World War I in the trenches, which in the book is very well documented, like extraordinary bravery, leadership, etc. So in many respects, a great man, but still was so totally devoted to spending years at a time in malaria-infested, dangerous Amazon in the early 1900s.
So I guess the other thing that I find really complex around characters like this is their motivations, right? So if you think...
It was glory.
Yeah, and if you think about the explorers that are known as explorers, right? So Christopher Columbus, Cook, Speke, Burton... They were effectively the recce party for occupation, colonisation, resource extraction, and ethnic cleansing. And whilst they might have been the first from our world to go there, with superior technology, with deadly diseases, I find it an uncomfortable thing to sort of celebrate because of the impact of it. That's not so I'm creating an ethical judgment, but when we're talking about them, and because they're so often celebrated and lauded, it is complex, and a lot of even if you think about Antarctic history or Himalayan history, much of it is wrapped up in imperial glory. So when they were trying to get down to the South Pole, there were these individuals who had this real motivation and drive to be the first, to plant the flag for their nation. And for the nation, that was an ability to say, we're the best. And there's this real obsession about just going around naming things.
Yeah.
Like, this is Queen Maud's land, and this is Victoria. But it's all part of occupation and colonization. So it's, and I'm a product of this. I'm half Indian. British Empire was good for me in the sense that I'm here. Had it not been for the Empire, and I think looking back at the history of these things, if you're going to look at what we often do is we celebrate the glorious moments of our histories, but we don't feel shame for the more shameful parts of our histories. So finding a sort of neutral, well, I'm not going to celebrate this, but I'm also not going to talk about this shamefully. That's kind of okay. But if you're going to celebrate one thing, you sort of have to acknowledge the shameful parts too.
So in all of the journalistic work you've done, what do you think has been the most consequential piece?
I think the most consequential for me was going to Ukraine in 2018. So I'd served with the British Army in Estonia, with the British Army Reserve, on an operation called Opkabrit. And after Russia had invaded and occupied Crimea in 2014, and then invaded and begun a war in Donbass in 2014, which is eastern Ukraine, the other European allies that had formerly been occupied by Russia wanted to improve the deterrence to stop Russia doing the same thing. So we were part of a British Army force that is now rotates through stationing in Estonia. And I learned a bit about the legacy of Russian and Soviet occupation in Estonia and the language and ethnic challenges that was creating, being stoked by the Kremlin. And that made me want to go and visit all the other places along that border that were having similar challenges: Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine ultimately. And that was where I really found it important to just go and ask people, but without arriving with my own judgment. I had my own background understanding of what was happening in Eastern Europe from reading academic papers, listening to historians. But how was this shaping the identity and beliefs of people on the ground? And traveling around all the different parts of Ukraine, which is extremely diverse, both in terms of the landscape, but also in terms of the culture. In the West, most people, actually within Ukraine now, 2 years after the full-scale Russian invasion, speaking Ukrainian is very much a form of identifying yourself as a Ukrainian patriot. But back then, most people in the West spoke Ukrainian, most people in the Far East spoke Russian, people in the middle spoke a blend. So, you had these identity differences, you had these interpretations of what was going on, you had interpretations of history, and I went to Donbass, overlooking the front line of where the Russian troops are, and I got permission from the Ukrainian government to go into Russian-occupied Crimea. And I think that was important for me because I was able to then write stories about Ukraine and what I took away from speaking to people who were there. I then went on and studied a master's in strategic communications, which is how does propaganda and information operations change the way people believe and behave about things. And then whilst I was studying that master's, the full-scale invasion of 2022 came about. And so it's consequential for me because until February 2022, whenever somebody said, where would you recommend that's a bit unusual, I would always say Ukraine. I loved it. I had a great time there. Hiking around the mountains of Western Ukraine with a guy that had been fighting the Russians for 2 years after the 2014 invasion.
Fuck, he would have had some good stories.
And harrowing stories as well.
Right, yeah, good in the sense that they are big. Yeah,
consequential, but he would have much rather have not had to become a soldier. He'd have much rather just been a jewelry maker and a mountain leader in the Carpathian Mountains. He didn't want to fight a war on his homeland. And speaking to people who would have previously said that they were Russian in eastern Ukraine who were now overlooking this front line, who said, I mean, I speak Russian, my background is Russian, but I'm not Russian, I'm Ukrainian. Yeah. Seeing this change in identity when they realised what Russia had become and what that meant to them was very powerful. Also going into Crimea and going down to Yalta, which is where there's a statue of Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill. And that was where, at the end of World War II, they basically divided up Europe, created what became the New Iron Curtain. And it's sort of great power politics. Didn't matter what the people in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania wanted. Churchill went, okay, at the end of the war, Churchill and Roosevelt said to Stalin, okay, at the end of the war, you can have that. Yeah. You know, the Estonians didn't want to be taken back over by the Soviet Union again. But meeting somebody there, he said, this is what we want. We want Russia to be respected and powerful again. So understanding and developing that empathy doesn't mean you agree with it, but you understand those perspectives. And that journey helped me understand that there will be people with beliefs that you can't rationalize out of them. You can't really debate or argue with them. That's like, that is the position they're going to hold. What they then choose to do with that, you might be able to nudge them gradually away from it. But understanding there are people who will have diametrically opposed worldviews to you and care more about the power of Russia than what individuals want or the individual suffering of people.
Since the invasion, have you gone back to Ukraine?
Not. I've explored a couple of documentary ideas about it. Haven't been able to get over there. I've also got a daughter now, so considering the impact on my family about me going into somewhere where I would go, where would be safe or safe enough or reasonably safe.
What's an unexplored angle for a documentary?
About Ukraine? Yeah. Well, in 2023, so a year ago, I did a documentary for BBC Radio 4 that didn't require me going into Ukraine. And that was exploring how Ukraine had communicated to the UK about what was going on so that British public support for Ukraine could be consolidated, really. Then that allowed our government to have the freedom of movement to support Ukraine as much as it wanted. I think, what would be an unexplored angle for Ukraine?
I just asked because it's a very well covered event in the media. Yeah. And for you sitting there thinking, here are a couple of documentary ideas, what's something that could be, very compelling and new, and like you say, an alternative, empathetic way to look at it?
I mean, I would love to tell the story of Ukraine, because so much of the story of Ukraine now is about the war. And the whole of Ukraine is at war and it's affecting everybody in Ukraine. But we hear stories about the front lines and the suffering of the soldiers, which is important to tell. And also, it would be good to tell the story of Ukraine. So almost like a travel documentary around Ukraine. Yeah. What is this country today? And how has the front lines being a couple hundred miles away affected people in Lviv? How is it affecting Kiev today? What is Kiev? Because when I went in 2018, Kiev was amazing. It was 4 years since they'd thrown off Russian influence, and the previous president Yanukovych was deposed after sending out snipers to kill 100 of his own civilians in the streets of Kiev following the revolution, what became the Revolution of Dignity in the Maidan. It sort of had this atmosphere that I imagine Berlin must have had in the early 90s, right, where this sort of tyranny and this police state disappeared. And there was a sense of, wow, we can do everything we want. We can be ourselves. We can be free. We don't live in a police state anymore. And it really had that energy and that vibe and that positivity of, we have moved away from the Russian imperial world and we're moving towards the European world. That was what it was. I mean, that's what Putin didn't want. That's why he launched the full-scale invasion. And there's that story about what is it to be Ukrainian other than just suffering an invasion. And I would like to tell that story. And talking about the history, I went when I was in Donbass in 2018. There's this valley called the river. It's called the river. Is it the River Donets or the River Don? Anyway, there's this amazing monastery there called Sviatogirsk. It looks like Rivendell out of Lord of the Rings, or it looks like Hogwarts. Yeah. It's in this amazing valley built into the sides. If it was anywhere else in Europe, it would have been a #1 tourist attraction. Right. But it was in Donbass, so people didn't go there. And there's this incredible beauty in the landscape and the culture and the stories and the history. Yeah. And in far western Ukraine, you've got...
the Khans rode through there.
Yeah. But, before the Khans arrived, it had... Moscow was its sort of... it's sort of like distant outpost of Kievan Rus culture.
I like that idea of telling how Kiev was this city so full of optimism and life and an expression of creativity, making a comparison to maybe Berlin in the 90s. And then just, if it's done really well, leaving the audience with this deep sense of empathy and like gratitude it didn't happen to us, because here are all these amazing people who are actually very, very similar to us and are now thrust into a conflict that's going to uproot whatever their career ambitions were, family ambitions, travel ambitions, and that's a really devastating reality that's happening.
Well, there's also the fact that if we don't give them everything they need, we could be next. I mean, England's probably not going to be next anytime soon, but Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they have a legitimate concern. Yeah. But, Putin and his mates have said they'd take the Baltics and Poland if they could. If we don't give Ukraine what it needs to win, that's not the end of the war. Putin's not going to stop with Donbass and Crimea. So you said that.
You're looking at it through the eyes of a travel journalist, but as well as someone who's served in the United Kingdom's army. Is it called military here?
Well, the British Army.
The British Army, yeah. Which set of lens do you look through mostly when you look at this conflict?
I think bringing the British Army is a bit of a job, but it's a special job compared to many others because you're considering defence all the time. And then as a travel journalist, really all you ever do is you tell the stories of the places that you're in so that people back home can understand it. And a lot of travel journalism focuses on the mechanisms of travel, right? So what country are you going to go to? What type of holiday are you going to have? You can have a beach holiday, a safari, an adventure holiday, and they talk about the facilities. And I really view all of those as they're just the ways of getting to, they're just the mechanisms. But underlying all of that is your motivation. Why are you traveling in the first place? And for me, curiosity, in the book I write about 12 different motivations, right? But the ones that drive a lot of my work are empathy, trying to understand the beliefs and behaviours of people. Curiosity, just asking, why is this like this? Inspiration, someone has told me about this place and I want to go and learn a bit more about it. And wonder, which is that feeling of encountering either a place or an experience that changes the way you feel about the whole world.
It expands your worldview.
Well, expand your worldview just makes you can see something you've never seen before, or you notice something. And here's an example, right? If you're out in the middle of the desert, middle of the outback, and you look up and you see the Milky Way, and you see everything, and you look up at a star and think, the light from that star left that star 60 million years ago, when 60 million light years? Yeah, it'd be the other side of the galaxy, wouldn't it? When the dinosaurs were still kicking around on Earth.
Yeah, that's glorious.
And you're like, whoa, suddenly your sense of time completely changes, your sense of space changes. And for that period of time, when you're in that moment of awe, you feel different. So I like my travel to do all of those things. The background in the army just gives me the ability to ask questions and think about things that not every other travel journalist does. And when you're writing travel journalism, you're trying to either do inspirational, which is telling people about something that they wouldn't have otherwise known, or informational, telling them how to do it. When I walked across Uganda with the Levison Wood, it became the front page of the Telegraph. But most people are not going to walk across Uganda or Sudan in the middle of summer. But they've learned something about it that might make them go there on a holiday or something else. So when I was doing the things about Ukraine in 2018, that was a place that people could go on holiday. Yeah. And I wanted people to be aware that there's this amazing country a couple of hours away by plane that is really affordable to travel in, that we should go and see. And when the war finishes on Ukraine's terms, when they hopefully win, I really want people to go back and travel around Ukraine because they'll need it. They'll need our support. They'll need to have money being put back in their economy so they can rebuild. And that point you make about, so you look at Ukraine and there's a familiarity. There's a familiarity in the way the cities are laid out. It looks like any other European city. It is a European country. And then when you speak to the people who are there, they want to just get on with what they want to do. They don't want to be fighting for their country. They want to be a graphic designer or a musician or a chef or work in software. That's what they want to do. And it's knowing people that are doing the same job as you, being forced to go and fight on the front line because of what Putin is doing to defend their homeland, that really makes it very resonant. You know, you can it feels very close.
Oh yeah, it feels so close. Eerily close to me. I've interviewed a guy twice called Alexander Kucherenko, who's a couple years older than me, just had a young daughter, and was a very successful engineer, right? So he worked for a Ukrainian company, but man, Ukrainian labor do most of the software engineering in Europe, first of all. And now he's in this position where he's thinking, the next couple of years of my life, maybe I'm going to open up my own business, become a very wealthy, successful man in his region, maybe move to Stockholm, right? And now it's the question, do I flee? Am I a coward for fleeing? But I have this responsibility to my family. And God, it really gets to me. It's so horrible because there is nothing different between him and me, except he was born in Ukraine, I was born in Australia.
And the thing that is also really apparent when you go there, and this is what I saw in 2018, is this real aspect of civil society and pride. So after the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian-backed president fled, Ukraine, there was sort of not really a government for a little while, and Ukrainians just really got involved and just sorted everything out. Civil society just turned on, like, how can we help? This, which was a sort of culture that developed around the Maidan protests. It was very communal, and everyone just got involved where they could. And then when Russia launched its invasion of Donbass with unmarked vehicles in 2014 and unmarked troops, people volunteered to go and fight. Actually, some of the first units that ended up stopping the invasion were what are called popular mobilization units. People just got together and went out and fought them. So there's this real sense of self-support and self-starting mindset that you find in Ukraine. And that has an impact in the way Ukraine innovates and evolves. So you look at their technological innovations on the battlefield. That is because you've got software engineers, right, and because you've got product designers thinking like, okay, so how do I take this and do this and build this, and then we can create an unarmed aerial vehicle that can drop a mortar bomb.
Create a drone for $50.
Yeah, so that kind of ability is a product of the diversity of society that's fighting the front line. Obviously, I'd prefer, and they prefer, they didn't have to do it. But
so, if I ask you, what is an example of great travel writing, who comes to mind?
One of my favourite books is by a woman called Kapka Kasapova, and it's a book called Borders. Was it Borderlands? Anyway, it's about, she's Bulgarian originally, she lives in Scotland now, but it's about that region between Bulgaria, Greece and Turkey, which is very sort of blended and ethnically mixed as a product of the various different empires that came through there. And then there's been periods of sort of swapping of land, ethnic cleansing, going back and forth, people moving around. And it's about her journey around that area, just trying to get a real feel for it and a real sense of place. So it's deeply personal, deeply emotional, and it just gripped me the whole way through. I really enjoyed Rory Stewart's A Places in Between. So Rory Stewart, Eton educated, very privileged background, briefly was an officer in the British Army, was a diplomat in the Foreign Office, who involved in the rebuilding of Iraq and Afghanistan. So he had a really strong understanding of politics and local politics and culture in those regions. And he walked across Afghanistan. And it's about his journey of walking across Afghanistan, the places in between, and turning up and just staying with people.
That's incredible.
Visiting places. And it's almost a bit of a, late 19th century great game cultural understanding. I think the UK probably has lost a large part of when we're trying to deal with the rest of the world. Not to say that the reasons for why we're doing that was good, but he had a really deep understanding of these places. He then went on to become a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party, and he became a minister. He left, and he now runs a podcast called The Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell. But he just has this really deep understanding, this ability to think beyond the short term in those places. And it's a really great story about his walk across the country.
Okay, so in that case, the Bulgarian woman and Rory Stewart What makes them? What is it about what they've written that is good travel writing? I'm trying to get to the bottom of what is good travel writing.
I like good travel writing that makes you feel in a place. So the descriptions have to be accessible but compelling. And when I started to develop my travel writing, one of the people that I read a lot of was Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway, won a Nobel Prize for Literature for The Old Man in the Sea. But he started as a journalist. And Hemingway talked about this thing called le mot juste, the one true word, where there was one correct word to describe everything that just really got to the heart of it. He also talks about the iceberg theory. I don't know if he gave the name to it, but it's the approach of you kind of write a concept and it's up to the reader to do everything else. You don't give them everything. You let them find it through the subtext, through the writing. And he also used to try and really reduce the number of words he used. You can read books that are incredibly long and just over-describe something, and you've kind of forgotten what you're being described about.
Because he was so obsessive about finding the right word.
Yeah, and his writing was really short and really concise. And the book that I write about and why we travel, the one that really captured me, was
The
A Movable Feast.
Movable Feast, yeah.
The one about his early years in Paris. And as I say, so you know this, is he's not a nice person to spend time with, Hemingway. He's cantankerous. He says...
Judgmental.
Yeah, he's judgmental. He's cynical. He is hypocritical.
Arrogant.
And he says himself he's got a fast, quick temper. So he's not a pleasant person to spend time with. But every now and again, he'll write a description of somebody or of a place. And the description of a place is just so accurate, so mot juste, that it's like you are there, or it's like a scene in a film. And, I get this perfectly. Or he describes people so well and without saying too much that you feel like you know them, that you feel like they're someone from your own life. So really good travel writing does that. It doesn't use too many words, but it gets to the heart of a place really clearly.
What I've observed in examples of just impeccable descriptions or lines that stand out to you is they're not using nouns to describe something. Rather, they're using feelings or words which aren't grammatically correct, but mean so much. There's so much subtext to certain words. And so therefore, by describing someone in a certain way, that isn't just a top to bottom noun and adjective description.
And yeah, it's using things that you wouldn't expect to. And
do you remember the line? There was a funny line about a priest throwing a milk.
No, it was a poet. I was just thinking exactly that. And he's talking about this guy who is basically having withdrawal from opium, and Hemingway goes to give him some bottles, and the poet basically chases him away by throwing bottles of milk at him, and he says, for a poet, he threw a very accurate milk bottle, and it just really kind of gets to this like. Oh, I can see that happening. I can see that. I can see the scene of you, this sort of like weedy poet suffering from opium withdrawal, but who's got an extremely good shot and is just very good at it. And it sort of summarises moments really clearly.
Do you think that there was a golden age for travel writing?
I think there's some amazing travel writing being done at the moment. Leo McCarran's just written a book called Wounded Tigress, but he also wrote a book about his walk around Palestine, Israel, and through Jordan, and that's brilliant. It told me stuff about a place that I never knew about before. I think I tend to prefer modern travel writing. Yeah. Obviously, I've drawn from the Hemingways and the Thubrons and the Thoreaus, but I think there's often a sort of
the world's changed so much.
So that's a good point. But the style of writing has changed, I think. I think people are much more willing to reveal their own anxieties and more willing to reveal them, put more of themselves in a book. Some people don't like this. And, my book is part memoir and part travelogue, part research and interview. For me, the memoir was important because it gets to the heart of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. And I think there's a bit more memoir maybe in books today. I started to look at a few of the ones that are on my shelf. There's, I love Robert Macfarlane. He's normally considered a nature writer, but he tends to, the way he describes stuff is amazing. Like some of his language is quite florid, but it's just so vivid and so compelling and so different to other travel writing. It's quite poetic in the way he writes. There's a guy called Nick Hunt who wrote a book called Walking the Woods and the Water. So he redid a trip that a guy called Patrick Lee Firma did in the early 1930s. So Lee Firma had walked from the Hook of Holland all the way to Istanbul. And he's just talking about all the places he went through. It's an amazing book. Actually, Lee Firma wrote it over 3 books, but Nick Hunt went back and redid that walk. And it's just brilliant. I found it such an enjoyable book that carried me along. It was actually done in a way that there were elements of it from sort of old style travel writing, but there was a sort of self-awareness that I think you can only really get in travel writing of the early 21st century. Then you've got funny travel writing like Bill Bryson, and he uses self-deprecation and humour to get to the heart of a thing and sort of reveal the ridiculousness of things that we take for granted. I don't know if you read his book about Australia, but his ones about England or the UK generally, it allows you to see something in the way that someone else would see it. Yeah. And that's quite a compelling thing.
And he's American, right?
Bill Bryson's American originally.
It's actually funny. 2 guests that I can remember at least said that he was the best author they'd ever read. They're envious of the way he writes.
It's really hard to write something that feels that effortless and that funny. Yeah. So he's funny, he's effortless, but it really comes across wonderfully. There's another guy called A.A. Gill who's passed away now, and he was a journalist who started as a TV critic, but he used to write travel stuff for The Times. It's quite acerbic, quite cutting, but he would...
Great words, acerbic.
But he would also just like... I don't know, conjure up a picture of a place that really summarised what he was doing and what he learned from somewhere.
I also see a bit of Tim Ferriss on the shelf there. Is this guy someone you take seriously? Has influenced you?
So I've got the hard copy of the 4-Hour Work Week, which tells you how long I've had it. Right. I found that a really interesting book because it really taught me, made me rethink about my approach to work. I don't know what it was like for you, but I remember leaving university. I had no idea what I wanted to do. All of my mates were applying for the graduate milk round jobs, at the big accountancy firms, or talking about going into law.
Classic London,
or maybe going into the army. And actually, I passed my selection to go into the regular army in 2005. But I just realised I could work in this office for like 70 hours a week, and then that company might just sack me next year, and there's no loyalty. What am I doing this for? I'm doing it to earn money. Well, why do I earn money? Well, I want to have a home and I want to do stuff. I was like, well, why don't I just go and do stuff? And there's something, he really talks in the books about focusing on the things that you're good at and sharing with others the things that, fulfilling the need that you have. If you have a desire for something or a need for something, other people will probably want that too, and that could be a product you can sell. And for me, that was compelling stories and travel. Yeah. And so by writing about travel, I was effectively doing that. I didn't turn myself into successful a business as he did. I didn't start outsourcing loads of my things. But I've certainly found those principles, which no one had really taught me early on, I think were quite good.
We were talking before we started recording a little bit about the publishing market. Yeah. And I gave some examples of books that were these outlier bestsellers for very serendipitous reasons. Tim Ferriss as well is another one of them. I have heard him speak quite a lot about how his efforts getting the 4-Hour Work Week published, because he was an unknown guy, and it was a genre of writing that hadn't necessarily been done before. So it was new. And he went to the South by Southwest Tech Conference, which I think to this day still is, but definitely at the time was where the biggest entrepreneurs in the world were in attendance. And Tim, without any press credentials or whatever, forced his way into the places where these people were drinking, he was very tactical about it, gave them copies of the book, but with snippets that this is actually the part I think is most relevant to you, etc. And through doing that, and then being very strategic, taking them, making the most out of blogs, which at the time in their absolute height, got this early promotion, which we were talking about, that then propelled him onto the bestseller lists. Which then is the domino the whole way down.
Yeah, and I think if you can find other people to talk about your work in a way that excites you, then if you can get other people to talk about your work, you're kind of borrowing their credibility, and they may also be the people with a bigger platform. And I think that's probably what it's funny, because I was thinking about Tim Ferriss when I was starting to develop some of the strategies for promotion of my book. So the hardback's out and I've got the paperback coming up. So I'm thinking this year, what are the things that I can be doing that are the equivalent within my world? It's not travel, but a couple of other books that I really like is Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens* and Tim Marshall's *Prisoners of Geography*, which, Prisoners of Geography took an idea that's fairly well known within academic circles, international material realism, and explained it in a way that made sense to an audience that otherwise didn't. So it's a great book, well written, using his journalistic expertise. But it's also about who ended up reading it and how it then spread. So yes, I'm starting to do the same thing with Why We Travel. I'm going to start speaking at universities and schools.
So give us a sense for the publishing market around travel books, both memoirs, armchair travel, like we were saying, and then yours, which maybe fits into a little bit of a different category. How do they sell? What are the authors that sell the most? And how can you, therefore, make yours an international bestseller?
So I lecture in journalism at City University London. And one of the things that I say to the students right up front is travel journalism, to my mind, covers two things: inspiration and information. So inspiration is you're introducing somebody to a place or an idea they may not have thought about before. Information is giving them what they need to go and do that. That's travel journalism. In travel writing, one of the subgenres is armchair travel. So that's somebody taking you to a place and doing a journey that you may never do. So my friend Levison Wood wrote Walking the Nile, 9-month walk from Rwanda to Egypt. No one else is going to do that. It's not like if you read a piece about, I don't know, going to Paris during the Olympics. Other people do that and go, I will go and do exactly the same thing, or go and do that part of Paris. So that's armchair travel. It's journeys that people otherwise wouldn't do. And the people that do well in armchair travel tend to be well known already, either through broadcast or television, or they've written quite a few books and they travel right about different places. And I guess you'd call much of Bill Bryson's stuff armchair travel, but the kind of people that he's going to places that other people will go to, right? So, the Appalachian Trail, Australia, England. So people who want to learn a bit about those places will then pick up those books. And they're like, I want to learn a bit about Australia. Bill Bryson, I've heard of him. I've read one of his other books. I'll pick it up. So they do well. And I think we were talking earlier on, 99% of all book sales come from 1% of the market. So those well-known authors, they will do well. You then have guidebooks. So books that sort of are completely informational. They're telling you all the stuff about a place. Brat guides, you've got...
Isn't it incredible there's still a market for guidebooks?
So you say that, but I guess a lot of people get their information about a place from Instagram or other forms of data and online content. But there is something brilliant about sitting down with a guidebook and looking through places, and you get discovery. Because you just follow through the pages and you find something you otherwise wouldn't have known about. And if something ends up being on Instagram, what happens is all the other Instagram influencers will go and replicate the same thing. And once you get there, it's just a place for Instagrammers, or just a place for people who follow Instagrammers. That very easily happens. So you just don't get the same, I guess, organic type of travel. I have no idea what the travel market for guidebooks is like for younger people. I can't imagine it's very big. I imagine most of the people who read guidebooks are sort of romantics like me who bridged that gap between when all there were travel books, guidebooks, and now when you can use the internet. So you've got that as another type of travel book. Then you have something like Capca Casabovas, which is Border, which is very personal. That kind of is telling you something about a place that you could travel to, but you may not do that sort of thing. And for her, it's about this fractious border. Where does Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece end? So it's telling you something about a place that you may otherwise not know. So that kind of goes into that kind of armchair travel. And then you've got something like A Year in the Med or Abroad in Japan, which isn't quite armchair travel, but it's a memoir about a place, which uses travelogue. So my book, Why We Travel, I call it smart travel or smart thinking travel, because I've drawn on some of the things that I generally have been inspired by in things like the 4-Hour Work Week or Sapiens or Prisoners of Geography, where you're giving people concepts and ideas and information that they may not have otherwise known before. So for me, that's mostly a lot of bit of psychology, bit of strategic communications, but also the sort of how-to that you get in a smart thinking book, like the 4-Hour Work Week.
Practical advice.
Or something like Why We Sleep, which is a book that explores the concept of sleep, but also through that can teach you maybe how do you sleep better. And so Why We Travel uses a blend of memoir, travelogue, so my own travel journeys, my own life story. It's fairly autobiographical, really.
Each chapter is punctuated by several anecdotes from your life.
Yeah, I kind of use those as a way to introduce the reader to a concept or a theme and why I approach this form of travel. Then I try and use like the kind of travel writing that I've used in my journalism to explain the story, to give people that sense of place. And then there's lots of research and interviews with it. So things that I've read and extracted and summarised, but also primary source.
Okay, right.
Yeah, first-hand primary source interviews with people, whether they are scientists or psychologists or philosophers, to try and get those things. And then at the end, it's my advice. And the advice actually is really drawn from my friends asking me things like, "Oh, Ash, because what people would say is they'd say, "Oh, what should I do in France?" I'm like, "Well, where are you going in France?" And they're like, "I don't know." And I'm like, "Why are you going to France?" They're like, "Oh, because I like cheese." Okay, so actually, what you want to go and have a sort of food discovery trip. And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's right." So why do you want to do that? Like, I just really want to learn about different cheeses. And they may not have been thinking that 30 seconds ago, but it's a bit like a coaching conversation, right?
And then it becomes a much more enjoyable experience.
Yeah.
More intentional. With still a lot of chance for serendipity whilst you're there.
So serendipity is one of the chapters in the book.
Absolutely.
And I think serendipity is a really under-celebrated part of travel. It's so tempting when you travel to do all the research on Instagram, on booking.com, whatever, top 10 things to do in Barcelona. And what you do is you basically just create work for yourself. Like, I've got to go to all these different things at these times. You book them all in. And your time in, particularly in cities, is just smashing from one place to another.
Standing in queues.
And you don't really have time to relax or enjoy and think. And some of my most enjoyable and rewarding experiences in travel, in places, have been the accidental. It was chatting to a guy in a cafe in Sudan, and he told us about a festival going on round the corner. And we ended up being some of the first Westerners to document it in journalism.
How good's that? What country is that in?
Sudan. It's a place called Kadabas. It's an amazing festival. It'd been documented in academia before, but I hadn't seen anybody write about it in journalism or certainly document it in video. And that was just because we chatted to a guy in a cafe. It's the only reason we knew it was there. But importantly, we had the time. We actually had to change our route, so we were going past a place. But we were like, well, we're walking past it. We don't have to be anywhere else. We might take half a day longer to get to the other side of the desert, but this is a cool thing to do. Totally. So we could do it. And when you look back on your travel, I don't know if you find this, but I'll use Paris as an example because it's such an obvious one. The places that stand out in my memory are not like the Michelin star restaurants that I booked into or I went on a press trip, or the hotel that put me up because I was going to write about it in the newspaper, or really even seeing the Eiffel Tower or the Arc de Triomphe. It was my friend saying, "Oh, come and meet me at this place," and going over the back of Sacré-Cœur on the north side, away from the tourist areas, away from Montmartre, and sitting in this cafe with this guy who called himself the mayor of Montmartre. My friend Hannah Meltzer, who's an amazing writer who writes brilliantly about France. She lived in Paris, and she said, "Yeah, come and meet me here." And my sister and I had this most amazing, wonderful evening that we never could have planned or predicted. And it was entirely dependent on who was there. The fact that I was there with Hannah and she was able to introduce me to a couple of people. That's wonderful, those opportunities in travel. And I think, if someone said, what's the magic in travel? I'd say it's probably serendipity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have the sense from me. I was emailing you about serendipity before, and every guest I've asked some variation of the question of what role serendipity has played in their life. And without fail, it's a serendipitous moment that has created the most consequential outcomes for them.
You asked me about consequential travel earlier on. Me going to Ukraine was entirely a product of serendipity. It was the fact that the battalion that I was with in the Army Reserve went to go and do this deployment to Estonia. I learned about the legacy of Russian imperialism, and I decided to go and do a journey. I got to Ukraine, and I had interviewed a British MP who was doing a PhD about Ukraine, and he put me in touch with his researcher who was over there, and she introduced me to somebody else who was able to take me around Donbass, and she introduced me to somebody who helped me find a guide in the Carpathian Mountains who had fought in Donbass. And we were just bimmeling around in the mountains. We got lost, and we found this door which had this amazing Ukrainian rune carved on it, and it's all just serendipity. And I turned up to Ukraine pretty much without a plan of where I was going to go. And it's just giving yourself the time and space to discover things. And that's both in terms of the joy of travel, but also in terms of how my career has planned out. I didn't plan to be a travel journalist. It just
and
happened.
Now you've written a book. There is no brighter beacon for serendipity to be introduced now into your life. It's impossible for you to say, who's going to read this? What's it going to then create an opportunity for you with? And then how will that change your future?
Yeah, I was chatting to a couple of public relations people, and they said, "Oh, I know somebody who'd like to read this." And I ended up doing a talk at an event at BAFTA, the British Film and Television Awards Academy yesterday. So you never know where these things are going to take you. Yeah. Or chatting to you, it was a product really of the book coming out. Actually, I was listening to Heidi Blake, who had done an amazing report that you spoke to her about on your podcast.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And
in my head, I'd reached out to you, but that's true. You said something about Heidi Blake's interview, right?
Yeah. I can't remember if you'd emailed me first or whatever, but you can never know how these connections are going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd heard Heidi's interview and was like, yeah, that was cool.
Nice. Oh, stoked. Do you know Heidi?
Yeah, it's like sort of professionally knew her from some of the work that she's done. Not incredibly well, but like I follow her work, and it's impressive. She's an amazing investigative journalist.
Mate, she's as good as they get.
Yeah,
she's as good as they get, and it's a shame that magazine journalism is so steep in decline that it's pretty much fallen off the cliff. But back in the height of magazine journalism, 90s, 2000s, Heidi would be an international star.
Yeah.
Because her reporting is so good and her writing is so good and the access she gets and her curation of the stories as well. Because I think that is probably one of the most important variables for any writer. What is your own curation? Do you pick the story that's actually interesting to people? And she's, in my opinion at least, got it in 10 out of 10.
So because I lecture in journalism at City, I was able to go to the event for the launch of their new masters there, which was in podcasting. And they brought along a load of people who won various podcasting awards. And one of the people who came was a woman called Basha. I can't remember what her surname is, but she is a journalist with Tortoise Media. And what Tortoise figured is they weren't getting as many people as they wanted to read their long form articles. Yeah. So they'd come out as a sort of, long form article, investigative, interesting stories. And they turned to podcasting as a way to get their journalism out there. And then that became an art in itself for them. And I think Heidi did a podcast of her last investigation as well. She did. But that's another way that these amazing investigative reporters are now telling their stories through audio, and then people might then return to read the print and read it in more detail as well.
Yeah, totally. Did Bear Grylls endorsement of your book move the needle at all?
I don't know. Actually, I'm going to be speaking to the publishers and I'll ask them. It would have probably moved it more if we'd have done an Instagram post about it.
Have you worked alongside him in the army, or is he just friends because you travel in the same circles?
No. So I've talked at his festival,
Yeah.
which is down in
I didn't know
Devon.
he had a festival.
Yeah. So obviously he's like this international superstar and almost a sort of cult figure in the world of adventure. But I did a talk at his festival. And that's sort of like my route to knowing him.
Okay. But how stoked were you when he, sent through those kind words?
I mean, it's great. There's other quotes and there's other people that have offered quotes that almost, and I'm sorry to Bear Grylls, do matter sort of more to me. Like my friend Levison Wood gave me a really lovely quote, and Levermine's careers are sort of run alongside each other, and a lot of the early work that I did in TV and other things, and many of the introductions come through him, and so that meant a lot to have those words from him. Aldo Kane, who is an amazing former Royal Marine, who then moved into sort of safety and rope work type things, and now presents and enables television programs. An incredibly busy guy who is sort of bouncing around between various expeditions and volcanoes and mountains and glaciers in Greenland, and then having a second child and running a bunch of businesses and running a expedition safety company. And he took the time to write the loveliest words about it. Really, you could tell he'd read the book. He hadn't just gone, oh yeah, here's some words, brilliant, take that. He'd really put thought into it. That was really meaningful. My friend Pip did. A guy called Nick Crane. So it's actually the people that I know better and who I know how busy their lives are and what's going on with them. Those are the things that really matter. A woman called Ginny Reddy, who wrote a book called Wonderland, she got in touch and was very effusive and very kind about the book. And she's an award-winning writer.
You mentioned The Last Tourist and the effect that maybe had on travel patterns. I also want to throw in there Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah.
Just purely observational.
Yeah.
How do you think that affected tourism and the way people think about travel as cultural phenomenons?
That point about Eat, Pray, Love, I hadn't thought about that impact it would have had on over tourism, and it's a good point. So Eat, Pray, Love is a book about a woman going through a difficult period in her life, and then she goes traveling, and she goes to Italy to eat, Bali to pray, Paris to love. I don't know. I've only watched the movie. But yeah, she goes to 3 countries and she eats. Then she has a spiritual journey, and then she finds a man she loves. Yeah. So there's 2 things about that. One, I think it's sort of most travel journalism is about solo travel, and one of the things that I do talk about in the book is traveling with others under the title of eroticism, and I don't mean for sex, but eroticism in the Esther Perel sense.
But that is a part of it.
What? Sex?
Sex.
It doesn't have to be. Like, eroticism, as Esther Perel talks about it, is the gap between self and other that creates a space for aliveness and excitement. She's a relationship psychotherapist, but I don't think it just has to be sex. Like, that's what you have in friendship, right? That gap between self and other that creates a space for aliveness and surprise. And for Esther Perel, she's talking about it as a decline in those things as a couple become too similar and don't create space for surprise and aliveness and difference between them. But that happens with travel as well. If travel becomes routine and you know exactly what you're going to do, there's no aliveness and surprise and excitement. And if you travel with others, if you travel with someone else, that can create more of the space for it. So that's the first thing I'm going to say about the solo travel thing. But I guess what Eat, Pray, Love did is it created a sense of aspiration for people. And it's almost like the challenge that you find with people that are following Instagram influencers and in travel. They go to a place for the experience that person has. I'm going to go to Ibiza and do this, and I'm going to have the same experience as this person. And you're never going to, because you're different people at a different time doing different things with from a different background, and
Different means.
different means. That's important as well. Different amounts of wealth, and you're traveling in a different era possibly, but also if you just repeat what somebody else did exactly, you're not giving yourself the space for discovery. The place for the author of Eat, Pray, Love to find good love may not be the right place for you or for me.
Exactly.
And the place for spiritual sanctity is not the same as it is for you or me. And I think she does go to Bali for the prey. I mean, was that one of the reasons why Bali became like this massively over-touristed place? I don't know.
I don't know either, but I would love to see someone do the hard work of the retrospective.
Yeah.
How these big cultural, and when I say cultural phenomenon, I mean popular movie, does actually drive significant behavior change.
I mean,
That's measured in the economic upside and downside of places. And sorry, go on.
well, New Zealand and Lord of the Rings, it
Very good
really boomed New
100%.
Zealand's tourism.
Yeah.
So I every time you do something in New Zealand, I love Lord of the Rings, and I love living down in Otago and riding horses where Rohan was.
That's pretty
cool.
That's pretty epic.
That was pretty alley. But every time you go there, there's people that are just dressed in Lord of the Rings stuff coming over for a holiday, getting their Lord of the Rings photos. And I think back to where we started about exploration. Even if you can't go to somewhere for the first time that any human has been there from your culture, you can still explore and discover new things. And there's this sort of, if it's not on Instagram, it can't be worth going to. Yeah. But go and find somewhere interesting. Go and find somewhere new. Yeah. I went to Albania in 2015. It was amazing.
How good is it? Yeah, I had the same experience. I was hitchhiking from Greece through to Morocco. So up through Albania, across the Med, down through Spain. And Albania was just a place which my impression was, I'll go through the country. Ended up spending a lot more time there and ended up just being so stoked with how good of a discovery this place was. Also regional places throughout Greece. But yeah, Albania was so special. They have this incredible, their food is so good because it's Turkish and Greek and Mediterranean blended. Their economy's in the dumps, so everything's really cheap. And it's it's out of the side of the European Union, so there's significantly less tourism there. Yeah. But their glory in terms of the environment is just as good as anywhere else in the Mediterranean, and their culture is very distinct and unique, despite being so ethnically close to all of their neighbors, because they had the most ridiculous 40-year period post World War II. But anyway.
Exactly. I mean, the story that I went to go and do there was following the route of a British secret World War II mission, going around.
Oh, nice. Oh, yeah, this was in the book, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's in the inspiration chapter of Why We Travel. Just bimbling around there. And yeah, I'd gone in the footsteps of this World War II mission. But back to the point we were talking about Eat, Pray, Love. I'm obviously not going to have the same experience as a World War II officer because I wasn't being chased by the Nazis. It wasn't winter. And I'm now in a country 70 years later. But what I did have was a route to follow that allowed me to learn about Albania today, eat amazing food, incredibly hospitable people giving me a bottle of olive oil because there wasn't, we don't have any in the shop, but I'll go and get some from home. It was awesome. And I think actually Albania really has just become a recent tourism success story in that they've really put a lot of money into the promotion of it. Got a lot of influencers out there who are doing lots of Instagram stuff. But you can always find a place that, just because it's now all over Instagram and all over journalism, is it better than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago? I mean, probably not. It's just better promoted. So there are other places that you will find that are like that. That just because no one else has validated it, who use opinions you respect, doesn't mean it's not good. And I think that's the discovery and exploration element.
What are 3 countries you'd put in that bucket? Unexplored. Unexplored's the wrong term, but Albania in 2015.
Albania in 2015, Ukraine in 2018.
What about right now, though?
I don't know. I have to go and find them. So places that are probably underrepresented for how great they are to go and see. I mean, most tourism from the UK goes to 5 places. It goes to Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and the USA. I think like 95% of our tourism probably goes to those places. And places that I've travelled to that are, I mean, now that, since we've had a daughter, my travel has been much limited. So there's not a huge number of places that I've travelled for the first time in the last year or so. Places that I would really recommend people go to. I love Estonia. Have you been?
No.
Estonia is amazing. The Tallinn's beautiful. The landscape and nature is phenomenal. Fascinating cultural stories, particularly down in southeast Estonia. Tallinn's a really cool city. The beer's excellent. The food's affordable and awesome. The architecture's amazing. Love Estonia. So that's probably one place. I'm just trying to think. I'm sort of moving my... I'm sort of looking over... I should get my globe again. Look at that. I had a really interesting time in Pakistan in 2022. Being half Indian, it's very hard to get to Pakistan. But I went there to film a series for Discovery Channel. Okay. I had a great time. Really enjoyed it. It was, a challenging, complex country, but I loved it. Japan's pretty well known as a tourist destination. Hokkaido, which is the island all the way up in the north of Japan, people go there for skiing, right? Sapporo, and that's what it's known for. Go there in autumn or spring, and it's just beautiful, like amazing, incredible lavender fields in spring. Wow. And then the fall colours, autumn colours in Hokkaido are stunning. Beautiful landscape, phenomenal mountains, phenomenal volcanoes, great hiking and walking. People think about New Zealand as a place where you go hiking, but people don't go to Japan for that very often. They're like, I'll go to Japan, I'll go and see all like the weird fetish culture and go into the city and just eat ramen and play computer games. It's also got some of the most amazing natural scenery accessible in the world.
That's amazing. Okay, nice.
So Estonia, Pakistan, and Hokkaido, Japan.
I have a question prepared here. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase it, but you mentioned Pakistan there, Albania today. We could throw in northern Mexico. We can throw in a lot of other places. My sense, and this could be totally wrong, is because it's just an impression, but the violence against tourists in certain parts of the world is actually worse than it maybe has been over the last 40 years, when the general narrative is one that it's all getting safer and better to go. Now, naturally, I mean, you're a pro, you've been in the army, you can easily avoid all these situations. But not everyone has that breadth of experience. And, 2 Australians got killed just the other week in northern Mexico. They were on a surfing holiday. Yeah. And I just don't know if that maybe is just... it's always been that way, or rather, actually, the violence. So the threat of death, not just the threat of being robbed, but the threat of death is significantly worse than it has been.
I don't have the statistics, or I've not done the research to be able to talk about this with any authority. We probably hear stories of danger and violence more often now, partly because of the way news works compared to what it did 20 years ago. There's more people travelling than ever before. In more places than ever before. So as a proportion of people travelling through an area, is the rate of murder any higher? I don't know. So there's a lot of different things coming into play there that only a proper academic analysis would be able to give you some...
Look, that makes sense. That's why I sort of said, I don't know if it's even a good question. But nonetheless...
Well, I just also don't know. I mean, is the world safer? I mean, there are certain things that have changed, right? So in the 1960s and early 1970s, you could travel overland from London to Delhi, right? You could do that. You could go through Iran, you could go to Afghanistan, you could go through Pakistan, all of which are places which have seen wars and violence, attacks, economic desperation, upheaval, invasion, drug trade. All of these things have made a huge difference. So I don't know about intimate violence. Journalists are much less safe now than they were ever. Journalists are being killed more in conflict zones or in places where they're investigating stuff than ever before.
Wow. Okay. I wasn't aware of that.
Mexico journalists get killed a lot.
Yeah, Mexico's the worst. But that's because... sorry, go on.
Trade. Yeah, Mexico journalists investigating the drug trade. Journalists in war zones never used to be deliberately targeted, but this is certainly something that started to happen from my reading of it, from speaking to journalists. That started to happen more frequently in the wars against ISIS, where journalists were not just seen as an opportunity, but their killing or capture and then later murder was seen as a sort of PR opportunity. So, yeah, things do change. I don't have the data to be able to give you a proper analysis, though.
You did mention something really interesting there, though, which tees up the next question, which is that more people are traveling than ever before. So the economics of tourism is downstream of disposable income. So it started with the Brits in your book. I got this. A couple hundred years ago, they started touring Europe. Then the US middle class unlocked 100 million plus people who can now fly all over the world and consume cultures from all over the world. Australia followed, then the rest of Europe. Now, over the last 10 years, China has been one of the best, just from an economic perspective, tourists that you could have. India's got 1.4 billion people with a rising middle class. Latin America, Asia, maybe even Africa. Like, we could unlock hundreds of millions of new people in the next 20, 30 years who now have enough disposable income to travel. So what leading indicators have you seen, and then after that, like, what does that actually do to travel, especially in places all throughout Italy where it's unbearable to be there because of the amount of people there at the moment? So I'm more asking you a question of projecting into the future. How do all of these new people who now have access to leisure travel affect travel behavior, but then as well on the red hot destinations, Florence, Rome, etc., how will they be affected?
In places like Venice, Barcelona, Paris already talk about over-tourism, which is where the number of tourists get to such an extent that there's not the infrastructure there to support them. Whether that's beds, whether that's restaurants, whether that's space in a museum. Or that there's no space or services for locals anymore. That's kind of what over-tourism looks like. This isn't a new phenomenon. We've seen that in places like Ibiza for a long time. So in the book, I sort of talk about the tourism evolution of Ibiza, which was a sort of Mediterranean backwater when modern tourism started to arrive in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But the thing that made a huge difference was the arrival of cheap air travel and the rising middle class in Europe. And suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people were going to Ibiza, where only a few years before, tens of thousands were. So what happened was hotels were built, massive hotels, services, restaurants, shops that used to serve locals could make more money serving tourists, so that's what they did. And this sort of idea of Ibiza that people went for had disappeared, and the term is Disneyfied. You've heard this, right? Where you're no longer seeing an authentic thing of a place, but you're seeing like a mock-up of what used to be there before. So the problem for that is, if you are the people in a place like Ibiza, and suddenly millions of dollars of tourism revenue are coming through your town, and you're like, oh, this is a good economic opportunity, it's very understandable why people will switch what they're doing to make money out of that industry. But the impact is that there's no longer any services for locals and no industry beyond tourism. And in any tourism town, you have this tension where people complain about it, but it's also their business. And in some places, they've become very wealthy from it. They've not to speak for the people of Ibiza, but that's a island that many people have gone from subsistence farming to jet setters in 2-3 generations, as in the owners of some of the land. So for some people, they've done really well out of it. But for people who aren't from that background, who don't have access to earning the money out of that industry, it's rubbish for them. And there's no other employment on the island, largely. So that happens in some places. The way Ibiza is dealing with it is limiting the number of new beds that can be opened, so you can't have more people in the island, and trying to put some money back into the economy outside of tourism. And they're trying to basically appeal to a wealthier tourist. So there's less people, but the ones that are there spend more money. The biggest problem for most towns is day trippers and sightseers. So you think about the old school way of traveling where someone would be on a coach, you'd stay in a hotel, you drive somewhere, get out, take photos, go to a pre-arranged buffet canteen, and you all sit down and eat there. So no money's going into the local economy, but those places are still bearing the burden of vast numbers of people in huge coaches coming through. And there's a town in Austria that's trying to deal with this at the moment, where it's like this beautiful place that appears in loads of things in the southeast, loads of TV series in Southeast and South Asia. So loads of Indians go there, and loads of Koreans go there, and loads of Chinese people are going there, loads of Europeans are going there, but they're not spending any money in the town. So how does that town deal with it? They've tried all sorts of things like blocking off the good views. They've tried to charge people coming into the town. So it's really difficult. So those are the socially negative impacts of tourism. And you have others that are even worse. So, the explosion of tourism in Cambodia, where there's very little regulation, and Thailand, huge amounts of child sexual exploitation, people trafficking, and actually all over Europe, places where, Albania, big cities. There's in London. There's plenty of people who, it's not a world that I access, so I wouldn't know about it. But there are people that are people are being trafficked and enslaved, modern slavery for sexual exploitation, and so these are problems all over the world as a product of people coming in, spending money, and consuming other humans effectively. And then there's the environmental damage, from the carbon footprint of travel through to consumerism. So what can we do as individuals to change this? So places can make it impossible for that type of tourism to exist. They can shut down tour companies that operate in that way, fail to give them licenses. They can ban coaches. They can do those sorts of things. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You've got, it just talks about the countries that are starting to come into middle-class tourism. They're going to have money. When the United States opened, you suddenly get a middle class of 100 million. In India, that's 600 million. That's if they're traveling in the way Americans do, Rome is going to be overwhelmed. And
impossibly.
But then you also have to say, well, for decades we've marketed these places as the ultimate thing to do and the ultimate place to go. Just because these countries have developed their economy later, should we prevent those people from having that privilege? It's really easy to shut the door once we've had all of our benefits. And, as I'm much more conscious of my impact of my tourism now, particularly in the carbon footprint perspective. But I've already lived in Australia and New Zealand, and I've already been to all the remote places. So if I'm now saying to people in their 20s, oh, you can have everything you want by traveling around Europe, they're like, easy for you to say, mate, you've been to Australia and New Zealand. Yeah. So I think telling people that they shouldn't do it doesn't work particularly well. Giving people better reasons to travel at home matters. Or we just make it too expensive. But then you have another issue, like, why should only the super rich be able to go to Venice, or only the super rich be able to go to Rome?
So the city doesn't get destroyed.
Yeah, but just tax the rich more.
I really think that actually is the way it's going to go. Whether it's through legislation or just the market prices of things going up because there is a supply constraint, like in Ibiza, they limit the amount of new beds. Or in Rome, they just say, you can't open up more Airbnbs. We're getting rid of these shocking excuses for a hotel or a hostel, and therefore, with a more limited supply, the price will just get higher. But then once you do go to Rome, your experience will be better. But it also will never exclude someone who really wants to do it on the cheap. They're just going to be more creative about it, and therefore they might actually have a better adventure doing it. But it means you can't really go with your family. I totally acknowledge this, and it might be the case there's no good solution. I can tell you with Amsterdam, for years they've been actively advertising, do not come here, particularly Brits. They don't want Brits, young British men rather, because it's such a good bucks destination. But the impact is so clear there. And as a former local of the town, you would just never go into what are the best parts of town, because they're just dominated by like tobacco shops and convenience stores, which is a completely rational reaction to all of these people walking by who just want a bottle of water or to buy, a joint. But they also serve as money laundering outfits, and they are only really relevant for a drunk person, tourist. And beforehand, they were cafes with lots of seating outside where you could have that extremely romantic travel experience of feeling like you're blending in with how the locals would live. And you pick up the magazine and you can read yes. So I know I said a lot there, and it's also a very romantic, maybe rather privileged perspective, but nonetheless, at least that's my impression for what it will happen.
I mean, traveling around India now is a very different experience to when I went backpacking around in 2001, because suddenly there's Indians traveling. You go to a town like Dharamsala, it's unrecognisable because all the middle-class Indians are going up there for their weekends.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's not the sort of like hippie Dalai Lama town.
Yeah.
It's like noisy Punjabis eating pizza. It's like Blackpool, but for the Punjab. And it's the solution that I try and give in travel writing is finding alternatives. So the sort of travel journalism term is something called a destination dupe. So rather than going to Bath, go to Cheltenham. It's still a Regency town in southern England. You can have a lovely town there. Rather than going to Stockholm, go to Gothenburg. Right. Rather than going to Florence, go to Bologna. I mean, Bologna's pretty busy as well, but rather than going to Bologna, go to Parma.
I think Italy has a tough time though, because you can objectively make the case that Rome actually is a must-see destination. There isn't an alternative for Rome, nor is there really for Florence, nor is there really for Venice, and so or Paris. And so some cities will probably just in perpetuity have this problem. But in those examples you gave of Stockholm, Gothenburg, absolutely.
This also comes down to people getting their motivations for travel wrong. In that, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve in your trip? Are you just sightseeing? Are you exploring? Do you want to have a foodie experience? Are you aspiring to what someone else did and you just want to replicate that story? Or are you going to discover? Are you going for a sense of healing? If you want to go and eat good food, you can literally go to any town in Italy. Yeah. If you want to go France. If you want to go and see ancient history, there's a certain type of ancient history in Rome, but you can go to North Africa and find Roman ruins and Roman architecture. Palmyra, the ISIS.
But it's not the Pantheon, it's not the Colosseum. I really think Italy does have a hard time here.
Although those are also marketing products. Like, what is, they've become celebrated because
they're amazing.
They are amazing. But
isn't it glorious even today to, you turn that corner and then, holy shit, this fucking thing here, the thing from Gladiator is here.
Yeah.
You can't replicate that.
No, you can't. But also is the juice worth the squeeze? For you as a traveller? Yeah. Do you want to fight through all those people and all that money? Is it worth it? Yeah. Don't get me wrong. You're completely right. Rome is incredible. Paris is beautiful. London is awesome. There's reasons people go to these cities all the time, right? And that will never change. And I guess it's just worth saying to people, is there another way you can do it? What are you really looking for in your travel? And then again, it's that same point I was mentioning earlier on. I had the privilege of traveling to these places, largely 20 years ago when there was much smaller crowds.
Ash, what is something you wanted to talk about but I didn't bring up?
I don't know. We talked about empathy in Ukraine.
We've been around the map, but nonetheless, I'm sure that it'll hit you either later or now, but something that would be an interesting thing to say, but hasn't been broached.
I think what I'd like people to think about is that travel isn't defined by where you go or the things you see. It's about the way you feel inside. And the best way to have fulfilling travel is to align the places you go and the things you see and the things you do with your original motivation to start with. But that requires a lot of self-reflection and understanding your motivation. And so much of our travel is driven by aspiration, which is a product of marketing, whether that's through social media or classic marketing or just the legacy of things. To ask yourself the question before you think about where you travel or how you travel, ask about why you're traveling. And that's going beyond the easy answers of, I want to have an adventure, or I want to have a rest, or I want to have a break, or I want to have some fun. Those are outcomes of your travel. The deeper things are those 12 motivations that I tried to explain. Curiosity, are you being curious? Inspiration, is there a story or is there a person whose journey or history you want to learn more about? Hedonism, do you just want to have fun? That's okay, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's completely legitimate. And purpose, that's usually trying to have a sense of reason for being there. Maybe that's learning something, like learning to ski, as an example. Mentorship, that is finding a teacher. That teacher could actually be a place. You learn something from a place like architecture in Florence. Or it could be actually finding a teacher that you're studying something within a certain place. Serendipity. And I think serendipity is the one that people should really look to more often, because that's where those accidental discoveries come in. Hardship is about just doing something really difficult. That could be going up a mountain, or that could be doing a marathon. And it's what you learn through doing that. So it's really that...
or going on an extremely low budget.
Or going on an extremely low budget. So hardship is a very specific thing, which is about suffering and fun. So it's this scale of fun. So you've got type 1 fun, which is it's fun at the time and it's fun in memory. Type 2 fun is it's horrible at the time, but you look back and you're glad you've done it. So that might be running a marathon. Type 3 fun is it was horrible at the time and you wouldn't ever recommend it. That's like something bad has happened. Which in mine and Lev's case was getting lost in Kashmir. And then type 4 fun, which is something that's really, really hard. It's still a challenge, but you are competent at it. That's when you get into a flow state. So this is something that, like, actually challenging yourself. You can do that intellectually as well, but traveling on a budget isn't like a sort of flow state as much. It's just it's traveling on a budget creates serendipity. That's where budget traveling comes in. Because I'm staying in a hostel, when you bump into people, we can't afford to go and eat in that restaurant. We can't afford to go up the Eiffel Tower. What else can we do? Oh, why don't you go up the Tower Montmartre and look at the Eiffel Tower from the other...
and buy a baguette from Carrefour.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where serendipity comes in. Service is going somewhere to do something, right? And that could be... For me, it was military service. For some people, it might be going to be a doctor volunteering in a war zone. You might go and drive aid trucks. That's purpose. And the negative flip side of purpose is volunteerism that can be badly managed. So there's orphanages in places like Cambodia or Kenya where the kids there aren't actually orphans. Their parents have been paid for these kids to be taken away to be educated, because the parents think that something better is going to happen to them. And it's effectively a human zoo. People turn up, they pay $2,000 to be there for 2 weeks. Teach bad English to these kids. The people attending these things aren't aware they're doing something really damaging.
Obviously, yeah.
But they're driving human trafficking, basically.
Yeah. Holy shit, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the film The Last Tourist. It's quite well covered in that. And there's organisations you can look at to make sure that the charity you are volunteering with is ethically good. So there's purpose. Then for me, there was the empathy. That's going someone to really learn about a place, really understand it. I got that in New Zealand. I'd like to go and do more of that in Australia, understanding the legacy of that relationship between the Indigenous or First Nations people and European Australians, for want of a better term, and healing. So I took my dad's ashes back to India, and that was part of a really long journey of psychological healing. There was wonder, which is that mindset you can have that allows you to experience all. Eroticism, which is traveling with others and changing your relationship with travel to create surprise and playfulness. And hope, which for me was taking my mum's ashes to New Zealand and turning a period of grief into hope. That's a lot that I've just talked about there. There's 12 of them, and they're all very different, and none is better than another. Right. We travel for different reasons at different times. I've travelled entirely for fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the thing I'd like people to think about is there's so many different reasons to travel. Don't try and get into a hierarchy about what's the best form of travel.
Yeah.
But be honest with yourself about what you want and need at that time, and then pick a destination and a mode of travel off that rather than the other way around.
Love it, mate. Final question. Every guest gets this. What is a country you're particularly bullish on?
What bullish in terms of I think it's great?
Bullish in the sense that it has a very bright future ahead of it. It might not necessarily be great now, but one you could invest in.
Probably Australia.
Oh, love it.
Or New Zealand.
Go
on. Because they're places that still, in my experience of going there, they're places that have a sense of optimism. They're places where there's still property is just about affordable in most of those places. Particularly if you get out of Sydney.
Out of Sydney, yeah.
Get out of Sydney, get out of Auckland. So it's a place where you could start a family and buy a house and get a job. People are still moving there.
Yeah. And live a great life.
Living a really high quality of life. People are paid well in those countries for the jobs that they do. So I think Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Amazing. Can you believe someone said the United Kingdom the other day?
Really?
Yeah.
Was it Nigel Farage?
It wasn't a particularly good answer, though, to be honest. He more just loves London. He lived here for so long. He's an American. Well, mate, look, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, inviting me into your home. And I listened to the book, absolutely loved it. And I was very stoked when I had discovered that you were potentially someone I could talk to, because I'm really looking for guests like you. I think it's most closer to my worldview, my curiosities. And I felt that throughout this chat and meeting you before. I think it was very natural. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers for asking me to come on and talk about this topic. It was useful to the people listening as well.
Yeah, me too.
If anyone's out there, feel free to get in touch at Ash Bhardwaj. The book's called Why We Travel. Through those two things you can find me, but I'd love to hear what you think about what we were talking about.
Totally. Ash Bhardwaj might be hard to spell, but I'll put the email in the podcast description.
Yeah.